What we hear from 19 and 20-year-olds consistently is, I wish my parents had not listened to my begging and pleading when I was 12, because now, all these years later, I am seeing what happens and how dependent and incapable of paying attention and sleeping and exercising or having an in-person conversation. I wish my parents were more comfortable being the bad guy or the bad parent back then and didn't acquiesce to my begging and pleading.
Welcome to FutureScape. My name is Kirthi Roberts and I'm the producer of the show, where we discuss innovations, possibilities, and probable realities, seemingly good or bad, of the future today.
In this episode, we will focus on a slightly different topic, one that is less about future technologies and innovations, and more about the impact of today's technologies on the leaders of tomorrow, or the next generation. In particular, on the impact of social media on the development of the brains of 13-year-olds. It is less well known that the region of the brain responsible for decision-making, inhibition, impulse control, emotion control, social behavior, personality development, and other complex cognitive functions is not fully developed until at least your mid-20s. While there are positive and negative aspects to social media, unlike the training and license required to operate dangerous machinery or a license to drive, social media requires no such prerequisite or license except access to a phone and decent Wi-Fi. Virtually all social media companies are still teenagers themselves, as I pointed out in an earlier video. While the impacts are not yet fully understood, there is increasing evidence of how the neural pathways are developed and how the young brain grows and is impacted in the presence of social media. In this episode, we will hear from two key professionals who have studied this subject from very different angles. The Chief Science Officer of the American Psychology Association, Dr. Mitch Prinstein, and a journalist and author of this article, Jessica Bennet, who followed 3 13-year-old girls and all of their phone activity for a year, while documenting the impact of social media on their lives. Both were interviewed by Hari Srinivasan on acclaimed journalist Christian Amanpour's team. Here's why Jessica Bennet decided to embark on this year-long study.
For some time, I've covered the lives of women and girls, and I've always been pretty interested in this statistic that shows that around the middle school age, girls' self-esteem tends to drop, and it tends to drop much more significantly than their male peers. So this was in the back of my mind as all of these headlines and statistics started coming about girls and teens in general and social media. We were all behind our screens during the pandemic, and suddenly it became very concerning, teen mental health. And we know that 13 is the age at which teenagers are allowed to join social media, according to all these social media companies. So we thought, wouldn't it be interesting to try to capture the intersection of this really precarious time in adolescent lives, and particularly for adolescent girls, and when they are allowed to join these platforms, and what would that look like? So it was interesting because this was almost like a dual reporting project, because everything that was happening, you were also talking to the parents about. So they were very involved. So we had 3 girls, London, who's in Maryland, Anna, who's in Colorado, Addie, who's in Michigan, really different, geographically different, ethnically different, come from really different families. But the thing they had in common was being this age in 8th grade in middle school, when hormones are raging, oftentimes friendship gets complicated, they're coming into their sexuality, they're searching for identity, and they're doing it all with a screen in their hand at all times. And so their parents had really different rules for them about how much access to phones or social media they could have. But one of the most interesting things was to see that even the girl who wasn't allowed on social media, Anna, it was impossible to escape because everyone at school was on it. So it's not as simple as just taking away your kid's phone.
Dr. Prinstein was not involved in this study, but here are his views on it and what the science tells us.
It was fantastic, not just because I have a daughter who's also 13, but and in 8th grade, but because it's really breathing life into what the science tells us, time and time again. 13 is maybe the worst time in our lives that we would have our kids spending so much focus on screens. Actually, I should say the second worst time. The first most important time for brain development is that first year of life. But coming right after that is that year or two as puberty is beginning. We're starting to see changes in the body, but that means that changes are already started in the brain. And the changes that are occurring in the brain are making us so craving that peer attention, rolling our eyes at our parents and talking about peers and how much they reinforce us or being scared of getting punished by them. So to give them 24/7 access to nonstop, reinforcement through clicking their mouse and searching online, not only is it potentially something that might preoccupy them a lot more than we want, but we're now starting to learn it actually might change the way their brain grows over the next few years.
And what is social media really doing to the processes inside our brains, and how is it impacting the biochemistry of the brain?
So the brain doesn't mature all at once. It matures region by region. And one of the first regions that changes is an area called the anterior cingulate cortex, which basically is an area filled with oxytocin and dopamine receptors that suddenly multiply. So we have way, way more of them. That means that we're craving bonding with other peers, and it feels really, really good when we do. Now, this region is also associated with our addiction to illegal substances. That's where the dopamine kind of kicks in. But now we're seeing that social media is activating it in ways that just don't parallel the way that kids used to grow up. So back when I was growing up, you hung out with your friends and you went home. Maybe you get a phone call with them. Maybe you get some opportunity, playing in the neighborhood, but not 24/7 worldwide quantified access controlled by artificial intelligence. That has changed the context in which these brains were not developed to interact with. And that's concerning.
How is social media used when there is disagreement, or as a tool to say and do hurtful things to your friends?
So a few of the things that played out, there would be a disagreement over something. It would move into a group text. People would start calling each other names. It would then move into Snapchat, where disappearing messages would be sent, but not everyone in the group would have Snapchat, so they wouldn't know what the person was saying about them. It would then eventually blow up, end up in the school counselor's office. And the school counselor is sitting there saying, this is all I do now. And sometimes it's so hard to even get to the bottom of these conflicts because the adults in the room, the administrators, the principals, the teachers, they're not as technologically savvy. So that's part of this too, watching these girls, and to their credit, they're very brave to share their stories.
According to a recent article in The Economist, hospitalization rates for self-harm have increased significantly for teenage girls since 2010. So is there a link between smartphone usage and bodily harm?
There's a lot of research coming out, and some of it is not causal, of course, because we can't experimentally manipulate some kids to use social media more than others and see how they turn out. That would be unethical. But we're getting what I call warning signs, enough accumulating evidence to suggest that there are some things, at the very least, we need to monitor, talk with our kids about, and pay attention to. We're seeing that kids are reporting, and just as we were just hearing in the report, a remarkable amount of stress because of all the platforms they have to keep up with, what they're afraid they'll miss out on, and how much overload it is to gather all this information at once. The more that kids are reporting what we call digital stress, the more they're experiencing depression a year later. We're seeing effects on sleep, and we're seeing the direct effect between social media use, disrupted or delayed sleep, and that is actually changing the size of how brains are growing over time. And that's a pretty clear example of how social media is having this direct effect on the brain. We're seeing addictive kinds of behaviors, what we in the science community call problematic social media use, with kids having tolerance and withdrawal symptoms that interferes with their ability to engage in day-to-day activities. We're seeing discrimination and cyber hate, and just being exposed to that, whether it's directed to you or not, has psychological consequence. There's a lot more. I should say there's also positive effects of social media on kids' development, but it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of situation. Every kid uses social media in different ways, and there are different things we need to do to make them all get the best out of it and avoid the worst.
Do strict rules on smartphone usage or banning phones really work?
It's not just cyberbullying, or it's not these really overt and exaggerated things that are occurring. This is like the daily anxiety that exists in the background of knowing that there are 17 messages sitting unanswered on your phone. There is a notification from your school that let you know that the quiz that you took today has dropped your grade by 2%. There are news notifications. One of the girls that I was with, there was school lockdown when I was with her. And, that's a sad reality of our teenagers and kids today. But how did everyone find out that that was occurring? It was a notification on the phone. So even in some cases, what the school administrators are saying is, we really want to set strict rules about not having phones in class, but oftentimes it's actually the parents who want to keep track of their kids. And in a situation like that, where there's a lockdown and the parents are finding out about it in that way, you can completely understand why they want to have access to speaking to their daughter by the phone. So it's tricky, and it seems that it's not quite as simple when we live in a world in which social media and phones and reality are all kind of blended into one, to just take one device away and think the problem's solved. And I guess what I saw be the most effective was these parents having pretty open and honest conversations with their kids about what they were seeing, asking really simple questions like, okay, well, how did that make you feel when you saw that? And if it didn't make you feel good, could you identify what it was about what you just saw that made you not feel good? And I think, just like Dr. Prinstein said, mindfulness and understanding your feelings, because we all do this. Like, we're swiping along, we're swiping away, we're going down rabbit holes. 3 hours later, you find yourself in a TikTok rabbit hole and you feel terrible about yourself and the world. And we, of course, are adults who can distinguish between reality and misinformation. And sometimes these teens can't.
Are the impacts of social media on teen boys and girls' brains different?
In some ways, no, not that we can see so far. So the effects on the brain, the effects on sleep, on so many different aspects of development that we've been talking about, we are not finding differences between boys and girls. However, we are finding that girls live in a world where already there are unfair double standard expectations on things like body shape or physical appearance. There's an unfair kind of pressure to succeed in social relationships. And it's the interaction between social media, which is magnifying what might already have been happening and has been happening for decades to women offline, that might create a particularly toxic combination of experiences for adolescent girls. So I would say that if you have a son, I would be just as concerned. But if you have a daughter, you probably want to recognize the unique ways that social media is really poking at some issues that are already presented in pretty unfair ways to girls and women.
London was not allowed to be on TikTok until her 13th birthday, and she had to present a very carefully thought out case to her mother about why she should be allowed, and they each signed a contract agreeing to specific rules. But once she was allowed on it, she could stream it into the living room through their TV. And so I came over to their house and they were dancing in front of the television set, and I was like, wait, what is this? Oh, it's TikTok. You can actually connect it there. So there's that. There are all sorts of ways around having these apps. You can have apps that disguise apps underneath them. You can access TikTok through YouTube from a desktop, from your school computer. Like, there are all sorts of ways around. So I kind of feel like the idea of just not permitting kids without having the conversations about it on these platforms is futile. We just aren't as good at the internet as they are.
There is no question that there are numerous benefits to social media, and it is not all bad or all good. The key is understanding both sides and knowing how to strike the right balance for your teenage son or daughter to reap the benefits and manage the downsides or the negative impacts, and not the other way around.
Yeah, I think there's almost two things. There's social media, and then there's the phones, which they're using to socialize in all ways. And there are plenty of benefits to this. There were lots of moments of joy, sharing silly photos, sharing memes. Like, the way that they communicate in visual platforms is just very different from the way I grew up communicating. Even on social media, for marginalized communities in particular, oftentimes LGBTQ youth, they can find community and like-minded people there. So there are real benefits to some of this. And I think that can often get lost in some of the headlines. There were real moments of joy and there were silly moments, and they're still teenagers. They're figuring it all out. I think that the girls were really brave and honest in letting us document even some of the messier, more, as they would say, cringy parts of being a teenager on social media. And they really hope, and I hope, that it can allow others to see something of themselves and maybe take a harder look at it.
And here's Dr. Prinstein's advice to parents about smartphones and social media.
Moderation. I don't think it's an all or nothing kind of solution. Let your kids on for an amount of time that fits the way they use it and the reactions that they're having on it. That's not one amount of time for everyone. That might be a half an hour for some kids, and that might be 2 hours for others. I think it's important to talk with your kids about what they're experiencing on there. Absolutely. I'd love for kids to get 8 to 9 hours of sleep, which is recommended by many different scientific groups. So, there's some tricky ways. I understand that parents don't feel empowered to be able to shut off their kids' phones on time. And I would say dig into those parental controls. They're not as easy as they should be, perhaps, to navigate, but dig into them. Parents have a lot more power and gatekeeping ability than they believe. I'll say one last thing. We have done all kinds of courses with undergraduates on this. And what we hear from 19 and 20-year-olds consistently is, I wish my parents had not listened to my begging and pleading when I was 12, because now, all these years later, I am seeing what happens and how dependent and incapable of paying attention and sleeping and exercising or having an in-person conversation. I wish my parents were more comfortable being the bad guy or the bad parent back then and didn't acquiesce to my begging and pleading.
If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up and share it with others who might find it fascinating. If you agree or disagree with the views of anyone in the video or have a question, I would love to hear from you. Make sure to check out our next video on another exciting topic related to technology, innovation, and promising future possibilities for all of us. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible, and see you in the next video.